Hi, welcome back. We're going to continue our 2 Samuel study with the reading of 2 Samuel chapter 10. So I'll read that for you now. After this, the king of the Ammonites died, and Hanun his son reigned in his place. And David said, I will deal loyally with Hanun the son of Nahash, as his father dealt loyally with me. So David sent by his servants to console him concerning his father. And David's servants came to the land of the Ammonites. But the princes of the Ammonites said to Hanun their lord, Do you think because David has sent comforters to you that he is honoring your father? Has not David sent his servants to you to search the city and to spy it out and to overthrow it? So Hanun took David's servants and shaved off half the beard of each and cut off their garments in the middle at their hips and sent them away. When it was told David, he sent to meet them, for the men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, Remain at Jericho until your beards have grown, and then return. When the Ammonites saw that they had become a stench to David, the Ammonites sent and hired the Syrians of Beth-rehob, and the Syrians of Zobah, 20,000 foot soldiers, and the king of Maacah with 1,000 men, and the men of Tob, 12,000 men. And when David heard of it, he sent Joab to all the host of the mighty men. And the Ammonites came out and drew up in battle array at the entrance of the gate. And the Syrians of Zobah and of Rehob and the men of Tob and Maacah were by themselves in the open country. When Joab saw that the battle was set against him, both in front and at the rear, he chose some of the best men of Israel and arrayed them against the Syrians. The rest of his men he put in charge of Abishai his brother, and he arrayed them against the Ammonites. And he said, If the Syrians are too strong for me, then you shall help me. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will come and help you. Be of good courage, and let us be courageous for our people, and for the cities of our God. And may the Lord do what seems good to him. So Joab and the people who were with him drew near to battle against the Syrians, and they fled before him. And when the Ammonites saw the Syrians fled, they likewise fled before Abishai, and entered the city. Then Joab returned from fighting against the Ammonites and came to Jerusalem. But when the Syrians saw they had been defeated by Israel, they gathered themselves together. And Hadadezer sent and brought out the Syrians who were beyond the Euphrates. They came to Helam with Shobach, the commander of the army of Hadadezer, at their head. And when it was told David, he gathered all Israel together and crossed the Jordan and came to Helam. The Syrians arrayed themselves against David and fought with him. And the Syrians fled before Israel, and David killed of the Syrians the men of 700 chariots and 40,000 horsemen, and wounded Shobach the commander of their army, so that he died there. And when all the kings who were servants of Hadadezer saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel, and became subject to them. So the Syrians were afraid to save the Ammonites any more. This is the word of the Lord. Okay, so mostly what we see here is that this is a historical recounting of some of the events that happened. This actually occurred in around 998 BC, according to our commentary, and it's the first of 3 chapters that are written about the Ammonite wars that David engages in. The setting of this story, I guess, sets up probably a more famous story, I'll say, that begins for us in the very next chapter, chapter 11, which is David's sin with Bathsheba. What you see in this, and it's a subtle point, but David doesn't initially go out to war. Joab and Abishai do. And David's relative inattention to one of his kingly duties is what leads to his time on his hands to be able to sin with Bathsheba and plot Uriah the Hittite's death, and the story that we're a little more famous with. It really has its setting in the fact that David is sort of resting on his laurels, if you want to call it that. If we take a look at 1 Samuel 8, verse 20, you'll see that that was part of the requirements of the kings of Israel, was that they lead Israel into battle. Again, that's in 1 Samuel 8, verse 20. That reads this. This would be Samuel's instruction for the kings. I'm going to start at verse 19. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." Well, if David was not going out to fight their battles, then and he was staying at home, you see that maybe what should have happened is that David wouldn't have experienced success in these battles, and yet he did. So a little more setting here. The setting for this is that David sends an envoy to see Hanun, the son of Nahash, in the wake of Nahash's death. You see Nahash earlier. We don't know much about David's connection with them, but we do know that Saul had defeated Nahash earlier. You can read about that in 1 Samuel chapter 11. And so it stands to reason that David, as the successor to Saul, may have been held in better regard, or may have been favored by Nahash. So there may have been a connection, but we don't know. We don't have anything necessarily in writing. The author, through of our commentary that I'm using, in a parenthetical note on the Hebrew translation, makes a comment that Nahash may have been the grandfather of David's half-sister Abigail. So it's possible there was a familial connection between Nahash and David as well. Another thing that we see here is that David, in doing this, may have been acting sort of wisely, because by trying to maintain relationships with people in the Transjordan area of Ammon, where it is. I'll try and put a map up here too, so you can see sort of the areas that we're talking about. By trying to maintain relationships with these people, he'll be able to utilize those relationships later as he's fleeing Absalom. So if you flip sort of forward in 2 Samuel in chapter 17, you'll see that he actually relies on people in this area as he's fleeing from Absalom. So what happens in the story, as you heard it read, is that these princes of Hanun of the Ammonites, once David sends this envoy to express his condolences, they expect that what's happening is that David is spying them out. And so they convince Hanun, the son of Nahash, to go ahead and send them back and don't let them have the opportunity to spy. But not only does he do this, he also embarrasses them. He shaves off half of their beards, and then he cuts off their clothing. It says at the hip in the English translation, but there's sort of two things that are worth noting here. Is the first is that a beard is the sign of a mature man. And as you look at me, I have the beard growing capacity of a 14-year-old girl. So apparently I'm not a mature man. But in these days, that was their sign. So shaving off half of their beard would have been akin to saying these men are not real men, they're not mature men, but they're half men. It sort of lends some credence to, I always think of like middle school, which is an awkward time. Like, everybody's going through puberty, and the guys, you have some guys that quickly were growing facial hair and stuff like that, and then on into high school, where there were others of us, yours truly, who really never did come into their own then. You see kids, high school kids now with full beards and stuff like that, and it was a sign of manlyhood, of manliness, and the fullness of sort of a moving beyond youth. And everybody obviously develops differently, but by taking off this beard, it was akin to saying these men are not really men at all, and they don't belong, as mature servants of the court or as fighting men for David. The other piece of this, where it says that they cut off their clothing at the hip, that's sort of a tame way in the Bible of saying they basically cut off their clothing so that everything below their waist, what we consider our waistline, was exposed. So their buttocks and their genitalia, were exposed.
President Johnson awarded 4 medals of honor to men from each of the armed services.
America owes you a debt of gratitude, son.
wounded. Where were you hit?
In the buttock, son.
Oh, that must be a sight. I'd kind of like to see that.
And that's another way of embarrassing these men. David, for his part, because they are loyal servants of his court and he cares for his servants, David allows them to go to Jordan and wait for their beards to come back into fullness. He doesn't have them come into his court in this embarrassed state. He allows the messengers to deliver back to him without having to see these men in person and put them to public embarrassment. So, that's a thing about David too, that he's dealing kindly with his servants of his court and the people of Israel, knowing that they're not his people, they're God's people. The next sort of scene that we get in this is that Joab and Abishai, brothers and commanders of David's armies, they go out to fight. And they take on the Syrians that have been enlisted to help Ammon. And they determine that both of these armies are maybe too difficult for them. They're skilled fighting men, so they put their most skilled fighting men up against these skilled fighting men. And I think it's important to note their attitude still. And I think this is a top-down attitude. When your leader speaks and teaches like this, then you are also of that. So if you look at verse 12, it says, "Be of good courage, and let us be courageous for our people and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him." So sort of two things in there that are spoken by Joab, David's sort of right-hand man and commander. The first is that these are the cities that belong to God. They don't belong to David. They belong to God. And then the other piece of it is "Thy will be done." Right out of the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's will be done. If it seems good to the Lord, he'll see to it. He'll see fit to make sure that whatever he wants done will be done. And so we sort of see the outcome of that. God saw to it that the Israelites defeated the Syrians and the Ammonites and all of the armies that had been mustered against them.
Pleasures.
Pardon me, would you have any Grey Poupon? But of course.
Grey Poupon. It even has wine.
Had been mustered against them. The other piece then that we see is that the Syrians saw that they had been defeated by Israel, so they gathered themselves together. This from verse 15. And that's when David finally gets up off his, old boring hanging out on the throne stuff, and he decides he's going to head out to war, to battle as well. And you see the result of that in verse 18. The Syrians, right before verse 18 and 17, the Syrians arrayed themselves against David and fought with him, and the Syrians fled before Israel, and David killed of the Syrians the men of 700 chariots and 40,000 horsemen, and he wounded Shobach, the commander of the army, so that he died there. What's the result of this? Well, the result that we see is that all the kings that were serving Hadadezer, seeing that they'd been defeated by Israel, this from verse 19, they made peace with Israel and became their subjects. So the Syrians never came to the rescue of the Ammonites anymore after that. And the other thing that we would know is that this is it sort of brings us up into the fall, winter time of year when people don't go out to battle. They go out to battle in the spring and the summer and into the late fall. And that's where we sort of pick up in chapter 11. So what are we to make of all of this?
Whoop-de-doo! What does it all mean, Basil?
Like I said, it's mostly a historical chapter that recounts for us one battle, and it's one of 3 chapters that we said involves Ammon and the battles between Israel and Ammon. We know that Ammon is still going to be a problem because even in that last line, the Syrians were afraid to save the Ammonites anymore. So Syria becomes subservient. One of the things that we see is that David's empire becomes now an imperial power in the region. He's sort of consolidating power. Nobody wants to go up against Israel, and this is noteworthy for David, so that now David becomes an imperial power in the area and recognized as a great king by the neighboring kings, with the exception of Ammon. The other thing that's sort of important in this chapter, as I mentioned at the outset, was that you see in some degree, David's neglect of his duty, and which leads then into, subtly, it leads into his sin with Bathsheba, which is an important story, in the grander scheme of things, with contrition and repentance, the writing of Psalm 51. There's going to be some major events that come on the heels of some of the things that are being set up right here. So that's an important one. And I guess maybe that final question that we always like to cover, which is, where is the Jesus figure in this, or how do we see Christ in this? Well, I mean, apart from the things I've already told you, which are sort of set up for, maybe more of what would be a faith-related issue, like with David's sin with Bathsheba and so forth, I would say that you can see the mercy that David showed his servants that were sent, to mourn for Nahash. That he didn't make them come back and be embarrassed. His dealing kindly with them. They didn't do anything to deserve this embarrassment that they had been given. They went simply as envoys, and they were just doing their duty, and yet they were. I wouldn't say that's necessarily the Jesus figure in this, but it is certainly a lesson that we can take away from some of this, and it's the way that God has dealt with each of us. We should be embarrassed of our sin. We should be embarrassed ashamed of those ways that we have lived, and yet God spares us that embarrassment by sending His Son and caring for us and forgiving us, so that we don't have to live in that shame and with the results of that shame, which is eternal damnation. That might be a bit of a stretch to try and say that that's really what's going on here, and that's the purpose of this chapter. Again, I would suggest probably the greater purpose of this chapter is serving as a setup, some of the scene settings. You get this a lot. A couple years ago, my family liked to watch through the series Breaking Bad. I thought it was an excellent series, a couple of seasons worth of shows, and then that's morphed into the newer series that's Better Call Saul, that came on the heels of it. And I always think of this, like this chapter sort of makes me think of when we were watching Breaking Bad. We binged watched it on Netflix, middle of winter one time, so we'd watch 2-3 episodes at a time, and you might get an episode in the whole thing that's sort of laying out some scene. It's laying out the landscape, so that when you had what kept us coming back to it was the excellent story writing, and the excellent acting, and the gripping telling of a story, certainly for our entertainment purposes. But you'd get an episode, and you'd finish watching it, and you'd be like, oh, we got to watch another one. It'd be midnight, and we're like, no, we got to watch another one. So we'd start it up again.
So let me clue you in. I am not in danger, Skylar. I am the danger. A guy opens his door and gets shot, and you think that of me? No. I am the one who knocks.
And, watch another commercial-free on Netflix episode, for 50 minutes or whatever. But every once in a while, you'd get that episode that was just sort of like, that's a good one to close on, because it didn't do much. It just sort of laid some storyline out there. But what the writers of the show were doing was they were setting up the scene so that when you'd get that really gripping story, it would really grab your attention and do something for you. And that's kind of how when I read this and I read the commentary behind it, that's sort of how I view this, is that this is a setup chapter. It's not unimportant. There are certainly things that we can glean from this, and it does indeed belong in Scripture because it's part of the story of David, and you have to set up that story of Bathsheba, and David is still the predecessor of Christ, and Jesus is the son of David. So all of that is important in the grand scheme, but as a chapter, we're going to look at this as a story that stands on its own, and the way I'm going to cast it is as a sort of a setup chapter. So for whatever it's worth, it is still very much the word of the Lord, and we can certainly take some stuff from it. Last thing maybe I'll mention in there then would be Joab, and as I've already talked about it, Joab's attitude. Thy will be done, and that's the attitude of Christians, is that we would follow according to God's will. Certainly in this chapter we see David not necessarily working according to God's will by not doing what the king does, but for us today, I guess that's sort of important. Thy will be done. In a time that things have gone seemingly mad, if we follow according to God's will, then we love our neighbor as ourselves. We care for one another. We look after the needs of one another, and we show mercy, as we've seen by David in this. So I think that's about all I've got to offer here. We'll get her edited up and posted, and thanks for sticking with us. Next time we sit down together is going to be probably a little more, with chapter 11, maybe a little bit more story-worthy. That's going to be one of those flashbang chapters or episodes that has us clamoring for more and looking for it on Netflix, even though it's maybe not been made into a story. I don't know. But looking forward to being with you next time. Thanks. Bye.